So good evening. I'm Diana Reisman, Executive Director of the Wharton Studio Museum. Ithaca is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, the Tioga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Ithaca, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So I'm so glad to welcome you tonight to Peerless, Fearless Fashions and Silent Serials, the 3rd lecture in a 4-part series from the Finger Lakes Film Trail. This series, Making Noise About Silent Film, Conversations about Cinema, Culture, and Social Change, explores the impact of silent cinema on society and culture in the early 20th century, and was made possible by a Humanities New York Action Grant with additional funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are grateful to Humanities New York for also supporting the creation of the Finger Lakes Film Trail. For those of you visiting the Tompkins Center for History and Culture for the first time tonight, it is the home of a number of arts and culture organizations, including Community Arts Partnership, Wharton Studio Museum, and also the History Center, which has its exhibit hall here and includes Wharton Studio Museum's permanent exhibit. I encourage everyone to see THC's engaging new exhibit, Recount, that explores the history of the era through the lens of the census. And in the atrium of the building, where you entered, if you're here in person, Historic Ithaca and Wharton Studio Museum's exhibit, Biggest Little Movie City, Ithaca's Theaters Then and Now, is on display only through Saturday the 7th. So please take a look. The Finger Lakes Film Trail launched in 2018 and is a collaboration between the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, the Wharton Studio Museum here in Ithaca, and the Cayuga Museum of History and Art and Case Research Lab in Auburn. Its director, executive director, Kirsten Gosch, is here this evening. We welcome her to Ithaca. And the film trail highlights the historical importance of the Finger Lakes region in the development of motion pictures. A visitor to each of these locations will gain a sense of the story, the narrative of modern filmmaking, from still photography at the Eastman Museum to the silent era in Ithaca and the Wharton Studio, and then at Case Research Lab, where Ted Case was one of the first people to sync sound to picture, so the beginning of the talkies. So now on to tonight's lecture, Peerless, Fearless Fashions and Silent Serials. Denise Green is Associate Professor of Fashion Design and Management at Cornell University and Director of the Cornell Fashion and Textile Collection. She's a recipient of grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Philosophical Society, and the Cornell Council for the Arts. And she's authored numerous journal articles and chapters of books. She's the co-author of the recently published Fashion and Cultural Studies. As a designer and fashion anthropologist, Denise uses creative and traditional qualitative research methods to study social, cultural, historical, and aesthetic aspects of fashion. Her work has received media attention in major publications, including CNN, The Washington Times, and Newsday. It is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Denise Green.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight, and thank you to our Zoom attendees as well for being here. I'm really excited to share with you this research that really began here in Ithaca because I became very fascinated with Irene Castle. Of course, this is the home of the Wharton Studio. They were known for producing, in particular, serials, which are we'll talk a little bit about later, that featured very strong female roles. So tonight I'm going to talk about some of those women. And I'm also going to share with you a little bit about the clothes that they wore on the silver screen. And in a lot of ways, I wanted to start actually with the Ithaca Star. So Pearl White came here to Ithaca to film continuation of the work that she had done in the first serial, Perils of Pauline. But here in this image, which is, again, as I was mentioning, from Cosmopolitan magazine, which is kind of important because it was a Hearst publication, and William Randolph Hearst, the media mogul, was very much involved in tying in his media publications with the films that he funded through the International Film Service. So you'll often find features on many of these women in various Hearst publications. But this one, of course, I selected because it was the inspiration for the title of tonight's talk. She was known as Peerless Pearl, unlike any other. And I love this quote: "She's never so happy as when she has some hair-raising feat to perform in front of the camera, things that other actors, even of the male sex, shrink from, have no terrors for her. The latest Pathé serial, The Fatal Ring, of which she is the star, gives her some splendid opportunities to display her fearlessness." And we'll see many of those displays tonight. But the fact is, Pearl wasn't actually peerless in that sense. She was definitely fearless, but there were many of these serial queens who were doing absolutely hair-raising stunts that even those of the male persuasion would have cowered at, as the Cosmopolitan article said. And of course, as the serial queen, she is afraid of nothing. And of course, as beautiful as she is fearless. So again, a number of women both used fashion, embodiment, athleticism during this period to transform cultural norms and expectations of women during this period in the 19-teens and the early 1920s. And she and these other serial queens really fueled this kind of radical change. They blurred boundaries between the identity of the character and their own. So there was often a conflation of the two. They performed their own stunts. Almost all of them performed their own stunts. They showcased their athleticism and in some cases their fearlessness around wild animals. They self-fashioned. They were responsible for their own wardrobes. We really have, in this nascent era of film, you don't have the elaborate costume departments that exist today. And so there might have been someone working in wardrobe, but for the most part, if you were playing the role of a contemporary woman at the time, you were responsible for dressing yourself. And so we see a lot of their own identity in the dress that they choose. And again, this feeds back into that blurring or slippage between the character identity and the actor's identity as well. But it was also an opportunity for fashion designers of the period to ensure that their designs were on the silver screen. So they would covet various actors, women actors, to dress them in their latest designs because they knew that they would be circulated throughout theaters across the country and the world, and people would see their designs and begin to associate particular women serial queens with particular brands. So this kind of leads into the cross promotion that would happen between the fashion brands, as well as beauty products and other kinds of fashion, beauty, embodiment related consumer goods. And then, of course, this leads to a really prolific both production of films. You'll see that many of these women, they just didn't stop working. Pearl White, in fact, dies quite young because she really just ran her body to the ground and was in a lot of pain. And, you know, and then you have substance abuse. She died of cirrhosis to her liver. She, you know, so this was not uncommon, though certainly many of these women lived very long lives. And the stardom, of course, just like stardom today, can have some of this negative effect on one's mental health and well-being. So all of the serial queens emerge in this early period of silent film in the 19-teens. We have the first serial comes out in 1914, and that period lasts for about 15 years, but really the heyday is the mid-teens to the early 1920s. And so this is coming off the Victorian era, and this concept of the new woman emerges in the late 19th century, a product of first wave feminism. The New Woman. I love this photo, the Frances Benjamin Johnston self-portrait. You see her petticoat, her ankles revealed, which would have been unheard of in this late 19th century moment. And of course, she's smoking a cigarette, and even just the way she's grasping that cup and sitting with her legs, kind of like how Susie's sitting right now. Yeah, so we're all, yeah, she is inspiring. But she represented a lot of cultural anxieties for folks, and also a lot of possibility as well. So the New Woman, she was someone advocating, it was a movement, really a new ideal about women's autonomy and independence. This meant having career paths, access to education, and of course, the right to vote, which is so important, I think, today, as many of us are thinking about the importance of voting in supporting women's rights. So fashioning the New Woman, I call it a trifecta of this idea of autonomy, athleticism, and aesthetics. And I use alliteration because most of these early silent serials were all about alliteration. There were the hazards of Helen, the perils of Pauline. And so I thought I would bring some of that sentiment into this talk. So again, this idea of women's independence, that they can use their bodies in ways that people hadn't really thought that they could, or women didn't really have access to physical education until the later part of the 19th century. And so you see with this movement in first wave feminism, women are starting to use their bodies and participating in sports in new ways. And of course, at the same time, doing so stylishly. So using various kinds of aesthetics, their interest in fashion. And at times, these fashions would be in tension, right, with the things that they had to physically do. So in a way, the fashion made the physicality and the work even more challenging than if they were wearing simply trousers and a short sleeve shirt. So what are serials? See, I've been talking about serials, but we'll do some basic information here. Serials, sometimes you'll hear them called chapter plays. They're episodic. Just like we have series today on Netflix. They're different from film series like sequels or prequels, tend to be about 15 to 20 minutes in length, and that's really determined by the length of a film reel. So one reel is about 10 minutes. So you have 1 or 2 film reels in these serials. They could be released over weeks, months, sometimes even years, though that's more rare. There would often be a corresponding serial story that would be published in a newspaper. Again, thinking back to that media tie-in, the Hearst Corporation and all of that coming together to ensure that if you did tragically happen to miss that week's film at the theater, that you could then at least read about what happened so you could catch up for the next installment. So typically every couple of weeks or maybe once a month, a new episode of the serial would come to the theaters. And these serials featured everything. It was action, romance, mystery, humor, and sometimes science fiction, and really often in quite hyperbolic terms. And that's where we get this idea of the serial queen melodrama. But what's also really interesting about the serials is they were filmed very, very quickly. And so in that, first week in the theaters, they could actually respond to audience feedback. And so the next episode might then address things that came up in the screening that perhaps the writers or the directors hadn't anticipated. And then in that response, there's an interesting dialogue between the consumer of the film and the producers. They were known or became known for the very suspenseful cliffhanger endings. And this is, of course, a hook to ensure that people come back to the movies. You want to figure out what is going to actually happen. And so the serial queen melodrama features very strong female protagonists. They are destabilizing gender roles with their bodies, with their action, and with their roles in society. They may not always be doing stunts. They might be a detective or have some kind of career role that otherwise people hadn't expected or that hadn't been normalized yet. And so they work to really normalize shifts in women's place, both in the home, in their family, in society, and in their expected behaviors. For fashion, it is a really interesting space for display of new ideas and new styles. It was a visual medium that the new woman came to be realized and shared across many thousands of viewers. And again, the media tie-in, there's product placement in these films. This is the first example of product placement. They are also the first films in many ways. But even before the shorts, which came before the serials, we see a really close relationship with product placement in the films. And I think most interestingly, the early film industry involved a lot of women as producers. And we know today that I think one might argue that there were more women involved in film production in this early period than there are today. So for example, what became United Artists, they had 11 women directors between 1912 and I think 1917. About half of these serials were written by women. They were the screenwriters. And almost all of these serials were edited by women. And so there was a very close relationship between both the new woman as she is on screen and the new woman as part of the production of the serial. And some will argue, and it's true, that the viewership was predominantly female, though certainly male viewers were there and enjoying these films too. And of course, for me, I'm really interested in the way that they functioned as fashion films. When we think about theater, it takes a little bit of time to make a costume change. But when you're filming something, right, you can cut, you can take as long as you need to put on the next outfit and then come back on screen, cut it together. So no time really passes for the viewer at all. You're able to see a lot of different garments and styles. So as fashion films, we see women doing really amazing and incredible things, that their bodies are enacting the adventure, they're solving the mysteries, they're saving lives. And this interesting tension then emerges between fashion and function, and in some ways actually draws more attention to the styles. This is probably not the best example of that, because we actually see here, Ruth Roland performing an aerial stunt, but she's wearing trousers, which again wasn't really quite common during this period, though we do see bifurcation appear on the scene with Poiret in 1912, the fashion designer. The other thing that's interesting is that the stars, this is an article here from Motion Picture Magazine, which I'll just read aloud. These actresses, they write, have wardrobes costing hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. We know of one well-known actress in motion pictures who paid $300 for a garment to wear in just one multiple reel feature. The gowns worn by these actresses are necessarily of the latest styles. Their employers demand that the latest modes be worn, and the gowns are the highest item of expense to these actresses. So again, these the women acting are actually responsible not only for securing, but also paying for the garments they wear on screen. And this, again, is an important part of the collaborations that they make with fashion designers to ensure their product placement. No more can it be asserted that, quote, any old thing will do for the movies. Any old thing will no longer accomplish the purpose, and the very latest thing is demanded and expected, not only by the high-class manufacturer, but by the discerning women in the audiences. The fact that serials could be produced so quickly, distributed very quickly, means that there was not a lot of lag time between the filming and the screening of these fashions in the theaters. And so that tightness, perhaps even faster than the putting together a monthly magazine, right? These are coming out very quickly. And so again, that idea that the very latest thing needs to be on screen is important. There's also ways in which actual direct accoutrement came out of these films. So there are buttons and pins, and there's a lot of merch, as we'd call it today. So the one on the left is from The Mysteries of Myra, which was filmed here in Ithaca. And the one on the right is Marguerite Snow as Eudora. Marguerite Snow was here in Ithaca in 1919 to film The Eagle's Eye, but Eudora was a 1914 serial that was very sci-fi detective. We'll talk about it a little bit later. And as I mentioned, there was a kind of what I'm calling a serial queen realism, or so-called, maybe there should be quotes around that, this kind of slippage between the character and actor, which again was promoted through the various magazines like Cosmopolitan and others, as well as newspapers. So for the rest of this presentation tonight, and I will keep an eye on time, I'm going to go through a number of different serial queens, and by no means have I captured all of them, because there were many. There were hundreds of them out there, about 60 different serials, I believe, over the period of time that we're looking at. But I've picked a few different women to talk with you about, and some of the films that they worked on. So these aren't comprehensive filmography lists. Mostly I'm focusing on the serials that they did. Many of these women later would do features or had done short films before coming to serial film production. So the first is Mary Fuller, and she produced, so that's sorry, I said 1914 earlier was the earliest serial. It was 1912, and the serial is called What Happened to Mary? And it's important that there's not a question mark after that. It is just what happened to Mary. And so this was an Edison production, so East Coast. Of course, there was Who Will Marry Mary? That was a question. And then another serial that she produced in 1914. What I love about these images, particularly the one on the left and the one on the far right, is she's actively not smiling. And she's really has this kind of tough face. And you can see, holding, literally, she's leaning her chin on a book. And so what is that telling us again about the new woman, about access to education, about the importance of text, but also the serial really does have its precursor in literature when we think about serial literature too. So I think there might be a little double entendre going on there. And then on the image on the far left, you'll see there's just a lot of different kinds of accessories, hair pieces, and I believe these are real flowers, and I believe it's a poisonous flower, but I cannot remember the name of it. Yeah, the trumpet flowers, but they're definitely poisonous. And so I kind of love that she's wearing this poisonous flower on either side of her head and looking very intensely at the camera. And then this was the last serial that she produced. And again, if you look at the way that she's standing, hands on the hips, really strong chest, she is a woman to be feared. She's both fearless and someone to look out for. And these were the kinds of advertisements that would run in Motion Picture Magazine and other sorts of Picture Goer Magazine and other places like that. So you can see here, the large collar, and this one a little bit more of a cravat. And I love the big belt and cuffs. And what Mary Fuller did, which really set the stage for a lot of the serial queens to follow, she did endorsement contracts. So in this case, she was endorsing Ingram's milkweed cream. And a lot of the early silent actresses, they were in front of very, very bright lights, which of course is hot. It could dry your skin out. So we'll see a lot of the serial queens end up endorsing various face cream products to keep their complexions looking very fresh. And what she also did, they often ran interviews in newspapers and women's magazines and motion picture magazines, where women would give, the serial queens would give advice. In this particular story, she's talking about health and the importance of exercise, of going outside and breathing fresh air, of feeling the sunlight. And so the importance of daily habits and maintaining the health, eating good food. So this became part of the discourse of the Cereal Queens as well. It was about their own athleticism, but they were also advising others on how to keep their bodies in optimal health. The next cereal queen is Kathleen Williams. She only did one cereal, but it was incredibly popular. It was called The Adventures of Kathleen in 1914. And in this cereal, she is traveling the world. She is going on all of these adventures. And for her, it was not so much about these crazy stunts, jumping off of trains or airplanes or whatever it might be, but it was about her interaction with all of these wild animals. And so that was her sense of fearlessness and adventure was very much tied to the fearlessness around travel to places that most people at this time in the United States are not traveling to, far off places, and the various creatures she would interact with. And then both before this serial and after, she did many films, both shorts and feature films, over 50. And I should have started, though many of you know quite a lot about silent film to begin with, which may be why you're here, but most of these films are now considered lost. The medium itself was highly flammable. There have been a number of fires that have destroyed copies of these films. Sometimes there might have been a copy made elsewhere. They tend to rarely these days be discovered, but about 70% or so or more are considered lost. And so even keeping track of the film, so you really have to source other primary sources, which is why actually the media tie-ins are really helpful to historians today, because you can actually go back and read what the episode was about if you only have 3 episodes of a 15-episode series. You can kind of piece together what might have happened, and then of course consult archives that might have film stills and other sorts of materials. What's really too bad is that, again, because the cereal queens were doing their own wardrobes, we don't tend to have a lot of extant examples of the garments or costumes that they wore. Whereas once we get into the Hollywood era and the talkies and the consolidation really of all of these independent film companies in the mid-late 20s, they have these huge wardrobe and costume departments and archives that they've been able to maintain. But again, another exciting aspect of this moment is that we don't have this massive consolidation of film production companies, and there are many of those as well. The Adventures of Kathleen is credited with sort of inventing or the first to use the cliffhanger, the suspenseful ending. And so in her travels and adventures, her thrilling adventures around the world would always end with some kind of cliffhanger. Is she going to survive? Will she get to the next location? How is she going to get out of this scrap? You have to come back to see it again. And I would be curious, Andrew, who's in the audience, who's a film historian, I've noticed that in a lot of the cereal queen imagery, not just Kathleen, but others, which we'll see later, this technique of having them look into a mirror and then their faces looking back at you, this tends to be this is the kind of leitmotif in the imagery at this time. And I would love to know more about what that's about. But we see her here staring into the mirror, right? So I'm thinking about it as, the mirror is the place where you look to actually get your face ready. And so there is this kind of intimation of how you fashion yourself built into the imagery that circulates around these cereal queens. The Adventures of Kathleen was so popular that there were lines, running around city blocks in Chicago to see the film. They had to do showings in the morning and other times that they typically didn't have to. And so huge crowds were headed to the movies to see the adventures. And again, we'll see a lot of different wild animals. These are just a few more examples of the, all right, so we're gonna head to just to see here a little bit of Kathleen. Oh, time code 1701. I tried to write my time codes down so I could scrub them up for you.
For Lord of the Jungle.
This was the title of the episode. So of course there's a series, and then each episode has a title as well. And, you know, again, using the media tie-ins, you're able to really get to listing out every particular episode. But I love this shot where she clearly is creating this relationship with this beast of an animal, which later the production, the man running the production company created a zoo in Los Angeles. And we're just going to go ahead to 28, where you'll be able to see her engaging one last time. It's a little small for me here with this animal. And so this is sort of the moment at the end. This one maybe not quite a cliffhanger, because this seems to resolve pretty wonderfully when she has this caged lion, and this is interesting. These titles are in Dutch, and that's because there was a print copy of this. This had been considered lost. There's a print copy in the Netherlands, and this is how it was able to be retrieved. So all of the intertitles are in Dutch, but of course here it's released, the romantic ending, and then we see this animal reunited with its romantic partner too. So it's all very, very sweet. And just one more here. This is another from a different episode in which I believe she goes to India, and we'll see her riding on an elephant. Let's see here. So of course she's with all of these elephants, and then eventually herself, even with her nice big suitcase, the hat, of course, to keep the sun off the face, and this very typical style of jacket that's loosely belted and flared at the bottom. And even in a skirt, riding the elephant side saddle. So The Adventures of Kathleen came from a book by Harold McGrath, and part of the cross promotion in this serial was ensuring the sale as well of the book. So that was also a way that you might be able to catch up if you missed an episode. But again, she does beauty product endorsements, excuse me, again for skincare products. And so you see her face, her glimmering, shining face. And usually when you get these headshots, you end up with a lot of really interesting sort of headgear. So Pearl White, who I began our talk thinking through, oh, thank you so much. I did actually need that after all. She films Perils of Pauline in 1914, which was Pathé. And then she begins working with the Wharton Studio on The Exploits of Elaine, The New Exploits of Elaine, and then The Romance of Elaine. And the latter one was filmed in Ithaca. This is her in her vehicle, and Diana has told me that she was known for speeding around town and getting lots of speeding tickets out in Teberg and causing all kinds of trouble in town. As I mentioned, she was a bit of a drinker and a partier, and Ithaca was quite lively during her time here. But she went on to film many, many other series. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. She basically didn't stop working. She tried to shift to feature lengths in the early 20s. It didn't work out so well. And then she ultimately left the States, moved to Paris, where she finished out her days in the Paris scene in the late 20s. And so Fearless, Peerless Pearl, here she is. There were a lot of magazine articles about whether her hair was real, and she was reassuring everyone it's definitely real. This is real hair, but that it would get really hot from all of the lights. Probably her most famous stunt is this one, in which she goes into this hot air balloon, and we'll see her. This is from The Perils of Pauline. She is outfitted in this episode primarily by Lucille. This is a beautiful raglan sleeve check jacket, very functional. I have to say, raglan sleeves allow for a lot of movement. So she gets into this hot air balloon, and I'm just going to scrub towards the end so you can see the really exciting part of this, which is her exit from literally hot air balloon. This was the source of so many articles in the media. How did she do it? A number of things apparently went wrong, and yet she persevered with her fearlessness. And of course, I love the way that her skirt sort of binds around her legs and actually helps her kind of slide down this rope as she gets to the rocky spot below. A couple of cuts there, but she makes it down, of course. Again, that skirt actually helping her to get down, kicks it off. The button's still intact on the skirt, and she's made it. So the character slippage was really important for Pearl White. She, she left at a young age to join the circus. That's where she learned a lot of the skills, but she had an accident when she was quite young, which made things a little more challenging for her. There's a lot of the sensational media. She's one of those unfortunates whose existence we learned in fairy tales, possessed of an unkind, unjust stepmother. It's kind of a lot of these tropes are perhaps true, an inconsiderate father, and to make life still harder, a poverty-stricken, thriftless home. And this was the impetus for her to join the circus. And I believe that it was at age 13, she hit the road. And she basically didn't stop working. She also wrote an autobiography, and it was published in parts as sort of diaries in various media publications. She talks a lot about her interest in fashion and sewing, both out of necessity, being poverty-stricken and working in the circus. So she became a seamstress at a young age. She writes about making her clothes, how she stitched many of her theatrical creations for the circus. So her interest in fashion was very much a part of her life from a young age. And so when she does have the money, she works with and is dressed by Lucille, Lady Duff Gordon, who had established her fashion house in New York City in the early teens and had become very well established there after her earlier career in England. She had worked with stage actresses, and that was one way that she got her designs onto the stage. She worked in Broadway with the Irene Castle, and she outfitted Irene Castle in Watch Your Step, for example. So she had really established herself by the time the serials take off. And she did many of the garments that Pearl White wore in The Perils of Pauline, and in many of her subsequent films as well. So we're gonna get really into some of these other stunt women now. So Helen Holmes, who you see here on the right in the cowgirl hat, she did a number of films, serials, including The Hazards of Helen. While it says there were 119 episodes, there were of the entire series, but she only really did the first year. It ran until 1917. She fell ill, and then we'll meet Helen Gibson, also Helen, who comes in next. So you'll notice here in this case, same with the Kathleen series, that the women who are acting have the same first name as the character. So this is, again, tying them very closely together. And so Helen Holmes, The Hazards of Helen was really well known for their train scenes. And of course, the train being the symbol of industrialization, this big machine, and the fact that women could both navigate it and use it to achieve their goals. And I love this image of her with the dog and the whole set crew on the right. So this is an episode called The Test of Courage. And she also did this phenomenal stunt on a bicycle, which also involved a train, which you'll be able to see in just a second. Oh, 9. So again, there's always some kind of train, boat, water, swimming, biking, running, flying, everything. So here we have her biking down the train tracks. And of course, the drawbridge is getting pulled up, but that doesn't stop her. So again, these women are doing all of their own stunts. It's pretty phenomenal. And in this one, we'll see one of her train stunts, which was pretty consistent. You would likely see one of these train stunts in a Hazards of Helen episode if you went to the theater to see it during this period. So here we have, again, moving train. And there are just the silent serials that do exist. There are many ways to see them now. Some of them it's a little more challenging, but there are a lot of YouTube channels. Serial Squadron is one of them. And I highly recommend checking it out if you feel so inclined after today's presentation. So dropping the coat, making the fashion work for you, and then ultimately she's able to land right on the train just in time off the rope and still manages to, isn't that amazing? Yeah, a lot of the shots in the film, the way they were shot, and she's actually wearing, it looks like on her head, on her hat are egret feathers, which were really quite popular, but also very controversial by that time in fashion. Helen Gibson replaces Helen Holmes in The Hazards of Helen when she falls ill. Can you believe it? What a coincidence. And she goes on to do a number of other serials also. But Helen Gibson was married to Hoot Gibson. They were rodeo folk. She often was at the Pendleton Roundup. She was horseback riding, and this is an early image of her. But they would also really clean her up for the fashion photo shoots as well. She's a real tough, very talented horseback rider. And again, in these images, you see that sort of really intense face, looking right at the camera, holding a gun or riding the horse. And she became known as Daredevil Helen. And the most daring actress in moving pictures. And so here we have just a few different stunt clips from the Hazards of Helen to give you a little bit of a sense of her horsemanship. And she's not wearing jodhpurs when she's riding the horse. And I think this is really interesting that in the film, it would have been somewhat common. And we see actually Irene Castle in photographs, photo stills from the time she was filming the serial Patria. We see her in jodhpurs. We see her in, oh, actually they're just bloomers. I didn't catch that before. So she is actually, looks like wearing the bloomers in that scene when she falls onto the train. And it just goes on and on and on in terms of what she could do. And again, there weren't the stunt doubles that people rely on today. And the stunts were, of course, a big part of the media promotion. When she does a stunt, it's recorded on 1,000 feet of film. It's sent around the country to be seen by movie fans everywhere. And so she's really becomes very well known and continues to work in stunt work actually for most of her working life, and really kind of in terms of time Many of the serial queens sort of retire in the 20s, but she continues her career, often uncredited in a lot of different productions. And this may have something to do, I loved this article about the stunt merchants, but the luck of some is truly amazing. These artists is truly amazing. When Helen Gibson was playing in the Hazards of Helen series of railroad dramas, she took risk after risk and suffered no mishap. Of course, many of these women did suffer mishaps. You know, in another, she traveled for 700 yards tied to the piston rod of an engine. She drove a motor car between two halves of a broken train, on and on and on, and yet she emerged unscathed. So Marguerite Snow, who we saw earlier, she contributes to this idea of the new woman in a few different ways, particularly through her work on Zoodora, which you saw the merch pin for earlier, which was a kind of sequel to the $1 Million Mystery, which came out earlier in that year. And this is actually, this is from, I believe, the Serial Squadron. We're able to put this together. And we'll see in this series, she is the mystic girl detective. So this is one of these early kind of sci-fi, mystical, silent serials. The Mysteries of Myra is yet another. And she plays the girl detective. And we'll see this idea appear later with Beatrice Fairfax. I won't talk about that serial today, but Beatrice Fairfax, also a kind of girl detective, but in her case, a journalist. And so there she is, taking on a new career for women. Ruth Rowland, again, a very prolific serial queen, but what's I think distinguishes Ruth in a lot of ways from some of the other serial queens, though not all, is that she later formed her own production company. She directed many of the serials, she did some screenwriting, and she produced them. So she actually had this Ruth Rowland Serials production company that was distributed by Pathé until about 1921. And this is a really big deal. So sometimes she would direct, but oftentimes others would direct. And she was able to, you know, display her athleticism, which you can see here with the tennis racket, but also in this Ruth Rowland, Ruth of the Rockies, distributed by Pathé, and again, produced by Ruth Rowland Serial Productions. This is really huge. If we think about this time, again, more women at that time in this nascent era of film than today who are owning, running production companies and circulating their film. So this is an example, again, of Ruth Rowland's work as both producer as well as actor and as stunt woman. The train never stops in the possibilities it offers to jump on, be on a moving train, and do all of these different kinds of stunts. So Ruth is actually not on the train in this scene, but she's in the train. And one of my favorite shots, talk about a good shot with the shadow of the hand coming down. But you get a sense for what a tough woman she is when someone tries to steal her bag, she grabs it back. And then my favorite part is that she starts biting the guy's hand. She just sinks her teeth right into the hand, being as resourceful as possible to get her back. She was not giving up. She gets the bag back. And so again, you can see her here in the fedora. So there's a little bit of appropriation happening with menswear and pushing the boundaries of what women's wear might look like with this blazer and hat. And in this one of, you know, climbing on the rope, a lot of the advertisements were often illustrations, but as well, there would be photographic advertisements too. So we saw the Timber Queen, and this is another really great train scene of a single car. And so we see her literally just, yeah, like it's nonstop, the action and adventure. And you can imagine as well, what it must have been like to be doing the filming. She was doing her own stunts, and then the cameraman was on there with her too. And ultimately, the guy swings in, pulls her off, and the classic train goes off the rails and crashes, and she survives just in time. And then in The White Eagle, which again was a 1922 production, I'm just going to scrub ahead to that. This one will give you a sense of something that's not, this one's not a train. Oh, excuse me, that's should have been 1921. Oh no, that is a train one, sorry. There's just so much train action in these films. Oh yes, this is the one with the airplane. So you actually saw the still from that earlier, the Ruth Rowland still of her on the airplane, and that's actually where it appeared in the serial. So Ruth Rowland takes her cross promotion and her endorsements in a slightly different direction. She was known for her amazing curls, which you can kind of get a sense of in this signed publicity photo on the left. And so she ended up working with a lot of different hair product companies, both for maintenance of hair, but also hair removal. So she did a lot with wig companies to produce her hair so you could buy it and wear it. But also, sometimes, and here's that image again, Andrew, that I was mentioning earlier with the looking in the face really closely. And you got to get all those hairs off your face, apparently, if you're a screen actress, or from other places on your body. So superfluous hairs, says Ruth Rowland says, removing superfluous hairs by means of sulfo solution now becomes a toilet pleasure instead of a dread. So you may now dissolve away those superfluous hairs, and just by a swish of a finger. And then she later worked for another hair removal product called Zip. And I love this advertising copy. It's off because it's out. And she also did some work with a pearl company, Betty Bead necklaces and girdles. A few more, these Zip, I don't know whoever did their advertising copy, again, it's off because it's out, hair-free limbs, and others. She also did some work with Lash Brow. Many of the early, not just serial queens, but other silent film actresses wore very heavy eyeliner. Most think of Theda Bara, sort of like Cleopatra, the kohl eyeliner. But there was actually a functional reason for this, which was, as you've seen in these films, you need to have high contrast. And so having high contrast makeup like lipstick and eyeliner and lashes is going to make the face a lot more visible on screen. And so she also, monopolized on that aspect of film to ensure even more money coming into her pocket. So these were very, very astute businesswomen. And there were often, various kinds of articles running about her fashions. And so the last serial queen that I'll talk about is my favorite serial queen to talk about, Irene Castle, because she's who really brought me to this research to begin with. She lived in Ithaca in 1916 when she was filming the serial Patria, which came out in 1917. The first 10 episodes were filmed here. She also did about 17 feature films, and I say about again because in many ways so much of this work is lost, and some of these films, if a film didn't do particularly well, it might not, or if it didn't have the media tie-in, it's really hard to kind of track down. You see in these images here on the far right, you may recognize Ithaca's Gorges. There she is with Milton Sills. She's wearing the jodhpurs here. And so we can expect that she was probably doing some horseback riding in that episode. Unfortunately, very little of Patria survives in terms of complete episodes, about 4, and some of those are partial. But what does survive is really incredible because we have many production stills in our archives here in the Cornell University library here at the History Center. The library recently acquired her personal archives. So the image in the middle is actually from another film outside of Ithaca, but she has an entire album of snapshots that she and her friends took on set. And while unfortunately she did not annotate them, so we don't know exactly the locations, we can make some educated guesses, but it's great to see her sort of on set and behind the scenes. And then on the far left, that is a scene from Patria. Gives you a sense of her agility. And of course, she was, before coming to film, ascended to fame in her work with her husband, Vernon Castle. They were known for the Castle Walk and modern dancing. But she was also a stunt woman, an athlete, and of course, a fashion enthusiast. These women were driving cars, as we saw with Pearl White. Irene Castle loved to swim. She had the first private swimming pool in Ithaca. It still exists at the Sigma Chi Fraternity House, which is the home she lived in while she was here in Ithaca. And this is a double exposure of her diving in a pretty traditional swimming costume from this period, which would have the bloomers underneath and a bit of a skirt above. This is one of my favorite photos from that album where she's practicing backflips off of a diving board. And this, again, was one of her personal albums. So I don't know the exact location. It could be Fort Lee. It could be in Florida. There are a number of photos from this album that look to be from probably Florida, including the one that Diana chose for the advertisement for this event, where you can see, all of the palm trees. And she's wearing a similar style bathing costume, but with much longer leggings underneath. And some other examples of those jodhpurs and her perhaps signing some autographs or maybe just writing letters. And what's wonderful about these albums is that you just see these kind of day-to-day activities on set. So Irene Castle was considered America's best dressed and best known woman. And as I mentioned earlier, the medium of silent film enables a lot of costume changes. And this promotional image for Patria is really capitalizing on all of the different outfits that she wore in this film, and that you could see too, should you come to the theater and see the episodes. And film is the first time that we see fashion moving on bodies that's not in real life and not at a theater. And so it becomes this really powerful medium for circulating, again, the latest modes, which she had to get as was demanded by her employer. She had to be dressed in the latest styles, but it was really Irene who was the arbiter of style. She was determining with what she chose to dress, what the latest styles would be and what would be possible for women to wear. She's creating a new idea of what's appropriate. And this is an important part of representation. It's not just a representation, as Stuart Hall says, of an existing reality. It is the production of a new reality that then circulates and is seen, and that kind of gets people habituated to a particular kind of look, whether it's women wearing makeup or it's women in jodhpurs or on and on and on and on. Irene, like Pearl White, worked very closely with Lucille. The story goes that she went to pay a Lucille bill, and that's how she discovered that her second husband in Ithaca maybe had taken a bit of her money because her bank account was empty and she couldn't pay the bill. Very expensive dresses. In her autobiography that she wrote in the 50s, she says that it was like a $3,000 Lucille bill. And so $3,000, and that would have been about 1923, is certainly a lot of money. So that article was not exaggerating that I read to you earlier, perhaps was even not representing the actual extent to which these women were paying for clothes. So this is one of the very famous Lucille gowns that she wears in Patria, and you see her photographed in it numerous times. And some of you might recognize this location, which is outside of Goldwyn Smith, right by your office. Yeah. And of course, the production stills, once again, are really emphasizing her intensity, her strength, her fearlessness, and her fierceness and determination. And as Patria Channing, one of the things I just love about the early Wharton serials is that not only were they, promoting all of these strong-willed, fearless women protagonists, they were also experimenting with film in interesting ways. Oop, we're going to go back. Let's see if I can get that. It's the only one that's not a YouTube. So they did a lot of work with split screen. So there's even one episode of Patria, which has a big part of it survives, where Irene actually plays two different characters, and they do the split screen, so she's able to do that interaction. But what she's wearing here is this military uniform. This is a military preparedness film, and this is supposedly what she told the media. This was her husband, Vernon Castle's military jacket. So she's taken his military jacket, appropriated it for this film. So we're gonna go and see her. So unfortunately, I have no clips of her doing any wild stunts, but what I do have, which I think is a pretty important part of her, there it is, 50. Here's the title card. That's where I wanted to land. I love this title card because, she takes command here of her forces. Her forces are just up at Morse Chain. And, again, she's in charge in this film. And you all might recognize, I believe this is there's a campus location for that shot as well. And seeing the military uniform on Irene Castle is really important because, of course, it's not just Irene Castle, it's the larger context of the time, World War I. In this fashion moment, a more militaristic styles start to become very, very popular. So I actually brought this from my personal collection. This is a style from this period. I can model for you. That really is that kind of green color. It's got the belt I mentioned. It's a little bit lower waisted as we're moving into the 1920s. And lots of buttons. You probably noticed lots and lots of buttons on these women's garments. And what's really great about this is that, nice big pockets. And here she is in the car, unfurling the American flag. She was, of course, a fashion innovator. She was said to be the first woman in America to bob her hair. And then she, of course, did a number of endorsement contracts, both during her time as a dancer, as well as during the serials. So she worked with hair companies, again, to do wigs so that you could have a castle bob without cutting your hair. She did work with corset companies, Redfern corsets, and with Regal shoes. But in Patria, which is the serial we're talking about today, and the only serial that she acted in, she really worked in these fashion tie-ins. She collaborated with designers and ensured that their products would be placed in the film. And she also, in various articles and interviews, would sometimes claim that she had a hand in creating them and designing them. It's really interesting that the dress that we displayed in the History Center exhibit earlier this year, we have an article, a primary source of her saying to Harper's Bazaar that she designed it, and then the Met, the Costume Institute at the Met, their record for the actual extant dress says that it was a Lucille design. And so it's really interesting. You have this kind of like conflicting sources, but there was certainly a collaboration between her and the designers. And she, like Pearl White, designed a lot of her costumes growing up. As well with her mother. So we have the Patria pom-pom, which the Gimbel brothers manufactured, the Patria Georgette, which was this, quote, entirely new fashion for the woman motorist. So she was designing fashion to enable other women to do the things that she was doing on screen. So again, it's sort of like that one step further to normalize not only the fashion, but the shifting roles of women. I think the most lasting collaboration that came out of Patria was with the Corticelli Silk Company. She launched Satin Patria. And again, all of these products are coming out at the same time that the serial is running in the theaters. So every couple of weeks you get a new episode, and you also get new things you can buy. And so these are a few of the different advertisements that ran. Some of these gowns, again, she continued her relationship with Lucille. And so we have the satin patria, and we'll see in just a moment the way in which Lucille factors into this. But she had these other products too that she invented, like the Castle Canteen. There was also the Castle Band. So she put her name and branded a lot of different fashion items with her own name. And so Lucille ended up doing a lot of designs using Corticelli silk. So, you know, here we have silks and satins of exquisite texture, and they're playing new roles in Lucille's workshop. So it wasn't Corticelli selling Lucille's gowns, but to be able to say that Lucille was using their fabric in her gowns, being the preeminent fashion designer in New York, was really important. She then worked to create first a collection of models, and we actually recently just acquired, thanks to a very generous donation from John Foote and Kristen Rupert, we were able to acquire the earliest extant example I've ever seen in any collection of one of her modes. So it's an Irene Castle mode is what it was called. And so again, this sort of collaboration with different fashion shops. And then a few years later, she would work with ready-to-wear designers to produce her eponymous fashion line, which was called Irene Castle Corticelli Fashions, and that lasted through 1927. And so the fashion collaboration, in fact, long outlasted her film career, which really ended shortly thereafter, 1922 or 23. And so in conclusion, to sort of recap some of these ideas around autonomy, athleticism, and aesthetics in these melodramas, it is true in many ways that these representations on the silver screen created new social, aesthetic, and embodied realities for some women. Probably notice that all of these women are white, all of these women are young, all of these women are thin, and so it's not that there weren't films being made by African-American filmmakers, but in this particular genre, I haven't been able to come across any in that realm in what are called the race films. So moving image in this time becomes a very crucial medium to share information about fashion. The tie-ins bring opportunities for industry collaborations, and of course, as we saw with Irene and others, creative business endeavors. And because film was this nascent industry, it coveted both women as producers and consumers. And as I mentioned, women screenwriters, if you look at all the copyrighted silent film productions between 1915 and 1925, half of them were written by women. Almost all film editors were women. In Los Angeles Times, the quote is, you know, one of the most important positions in the motion picture industry is held almost entirely by women. And that was the cutters working on in the editing room. And women worked as directors. And as we saw with Ruth Rowland and others as well, Helen Gibson worked to start a production company as well. And it's important to note that there were a number of African-American women filmmakers as well. They didn't work on serial productions, but a number of African-American women filmmakers. It wasn't just in this genre, it's a larger part of this narrative. So it's all kind of comes together for me. I think the most exciting part is not just the women that we see on the screen or the women sitting in the theaters, but the women who are behind the scenes as well, doing the writing, the production, and the imagining of how to create these fearless women and how to ensure that that idea is spread around the country, and these serial queens adorn themselves in ways to really convey that and capture that to sit with the viewing public. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you to many, many different people and entities who have been able to make this possible today. And I'm happy to take from you any questions, as well as in the Zoom world too. Yeah.
I have so many questions for you, but all right, I'll start with this one. How the actresses had to get the dresses,
Yes.
right? But the designers wanted them to have them,
Yes.
right? So did the designers say like, hey, listen, you know, you can have my dress for free? Like, Did the actresses really have to pay for them if the designers were?
Well, I know that Irene Castle was paying Lucille bills.
Yes, right. Yes.
So yes, now that information is really hard to glean unless you have someone's personal archives with all of their receipts and like business transcripts, or
Totally.
maybe if they'd written, many of these women actually did write autobiographies. Pearl Wright wrote Just Me. Irene Castle wrote Castles in the Air. And so it's possible to maybe glean some of that information there, but I think people can tend to be kind of private about like maybe that sort of thing.
Well, it's just, no, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I think Diana was going to add something.
Mine was closed, I think they're for their personal wardrobes.
Uh-huh.
So they paid for them, but then when they were acting in these films, it was sort of incumbent on them to come to the set with the appropriate
Totally.
dress for whatever.
Yeah,
scenes.
and there wasn't a line between the personal wardrobe and the film like their personal wardrobe was what they were wearing on the sets. So again, that slippage, right, between the actor as a distinct person and the character, they're both one and the same in terms of what they're actually wearing on the set and on the screen. Yes.
Out of curiosity, how much do you pay to afford a $300 dress?
I think some of them were paid actually quite well. And that's even true during this era of the women who were doing the screenwriting and the directing. They were paid well, relatively well. I think, again, if we compare things maybe to the gender dynamics in film today, this was a much different scene. And then we see the consolidation of all of these independent film production companies, and then the emergence of talkies and large corporate, entities that we end up where we are today. But again, it's really interesting. We can go to the archives to better answer that question. I can go to the archives at the library, and there are a lot of Wharton Studio business records, for example, and they actually have like itemized like how much they were paying their cameramen, how much they were paying the actors. And of course, each production is going to be slightly different. There'll be some kind of negotiation that happens. But I think that the business side of this is really interesting and really deserves a lot more investigation, because it was so different then. People were kind of figuring it out than it is today, where actors have agents and all kinds of other aspects of, they have a stylist, that comes and outfits them. All of these roles we don't really have, though, in some cases we see, like in Patria, Irene Castle, like with her maid, helping her to get dressed or whatever, but it's, it's very different than today's stylist on a Hollywood set. So I don't actually have an exact answer, but
We can afford it.
yeah, but I think they could afford it. Yeah. Andrew, do you have another? Oh, no, it's okay. Oh, what, if you want to give Susie's got one too, so.
Well, I just have a little bit of gossip.
Oh, good.
Pearl White actually became a millionaire, even in terms, a million at the time, not just millions in our dollars. And she took her career to Paris, where she got paid even more.
Mhm.
And it had a whole, she was making films for Cathay. She just took her whole show there and invested in resorts and racetracks.
Oh,
Met
that's
the
right.
love of her life, moved to a home in Cairo. I'm telling you, she did it all. And even understood, even though, as you said, when you said she died of cirrhosis, I thought, oh, maybe she was, broke and,
No, she was not.
She was a millionaire
No,
and losing her liver, and planned her death very carefully, picked out her grave, everything, and like a very meticulous, about unusual, I think. So many.
Mhm.
I was telling Denise earlier, I have, my grandmother was a Nickelodeon player and just devoted to Hollywood stars and would write to all of them, and many of them people that didn't become big, which is most of them. would write the most painful letters of just, having nothing to eat and nothing but the clothes on their back and hoping they would make it. She was really, I think she and Irene were exceptional.
Yeah, they did very well for themselves. And I think too, with all of these, they were very astute business women too,
Yes.
with all of the endorsement contracts and the various collaborations. They weren't just making money from the films, they were making money in a lot of different arenas. And Irene continued to do endorsement contracts throughout her life. Like there's salad advertisements from the 50s and whatnot, where she's, keeping her trim figure at that age, and by having this particular salad dressing. And so yeah, it's ongoing. Definitely. It's not that once these women retired, quote unquote, from the industry, that was it. They continue to navigate this world and to ensure their wealth and ongoing access to fashionable dress. Yeah, Andrew.
I'm just so happy to have this in my understanding of film history now, because I in film, as a film major and a film PhD, we didn't deal with serials because they were not Eisenstein. But this makes so, my question is, why did, I noticed 1922 was about the end of the serial kind of thing ends around that time?
Yeah, 22-ish.
Why is
Because
that?
feature films come into play. So first you have the shorts.
Yeah.
Shorts.
Yeah, of course.
And then you have the serials, and shorts are still, and then features start to come into play. And then you get feature films, and a lot of the serial queens sort of leave serials because it's almost seen as that low, and same way today, television versus feature film. It's like a step up. And so it becomes the coveted medium. And then of course the talkies come into play.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm just in the throes of reading Sam Goldwyn's biography,
Oh,
which
wow.
is really
I
fascinating.
can only imagine.
Because you get a real sense of Hollywood was, at the same time that the Whartons were here, which is 1914, 1915 to 1920. I mean, on the West Coast, Hollywood was burgeoning at that time. And all these players who went on, Daryl Zanuck and Jack Warner, Mary Pickford, who was one of the founders with Douglas Pickford and Charlie Chaplin, United Artists. They were all on the West Coast creating these studios that, as Denise mentioned, eventually
Consolidated.
And
then they consolidate their film prints into one location that goes up in flames.
And I think they just also felt that they could make more money by making these longer films, and people were sitting in in their seats in the theaters for an hour or whatever for the feature films. So serials kind of just faded and became sort of now the feature experience. And can I just make a little plug?
Oh, yeah.
It's sort of what we're talking about. So this is the
And the spirit of a tie-in.
This is a
And
tie-in.
cross
Yes,
promotion.
this is a tie-in. So this is the third lecture in our four-part series. And the next one is taking place at the Dryden Theater at George Eastman. And it's called From Nickelodeon to Movie Palace, the Phenomenon of Early Cinema as Mass Entertainment.
When is that?
That's on May 21st. It's also going to be on Zoom. And it's being given by Ken Fox, who's head of the library archives at Eastman. He's a wonderful, he's just a smart and wonderful guy and a very good speaker. And that's going to be on Zoom too. So if you can't make it to the George Eastman Museum, which is worth a trip, if you've never been, just go to the Finger Lakes from Toga website, and Pat will have put the link to the Zoom for that on May 21st. And so he's really talking about the movie, sort of what Barbara Luback talked about for our class lecture. So what was it like
To go to the
going
movies.
to the movies in this era, and how mass entertainment was developing.
And one more thing I want to say to your question, Andrew, is I struggle with the serials, short-lived, don't get as much attention. And then people classify this moment as sort of the starting point of the damsel in distress,
Uh-huh.
which could be, I mean, yes, they are women in distress because they're chasing down somebody or having to bite some guy's hand because their purse is getting stolen or whatever the situation is. Yes, it's distressing, but that, I feel like that term, damsel in distress, really, for me, does not capture the strength, the, innovative thinking on the spot, the new woman that these serial queens embodied literally and performed. And so that's kind of also for me, when film history is taught or talked about, that people will look to the serial queen melodramas as sort of the start of the damsel in distress trope. And it's not at all that. And so it's really frustrating. That's my next project, is to figure out how that language
Well, is there a
came
feature
into.
queen? Are there feature queens who are doing?
No,
that?
so I should say that the serial queen, there is a film scholar, Benjamin Singer, who in the early 90s sort of he coins this phrase, but the serial queen melodrama.
Yeah.
But when you look at the newspaper articles of the period, the primary sources, they are called serial queens. I think there are a few different examples, and so that's where the term comes from. And I'm okay with queen because, it means you're the one in charge. So I feel like that's fine. But damsel in distress, I struggle with that a bit. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
If you took all of those that you showed them, dropping out of the balloon, jumping onto the train, spiking off the end of the pit, replace a female with a male, put it in a movie, no one would ever describe it as, a poor little boy in distress. Or
Yeah, exactly.
They would say heroic man, heroically does this, heroic whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Female,
Yeah, exactly. Who's gonna go? You guys want to duke it out, or we'll let Park go, and then we'll go back to Susie, since Susie had one.
Well, other serials of the time, contemporaneous serials, they did have the damsel in distress on the railroad tracks.
Yes, yeah. These were the serial queens, yeah.
Larger scene of these films, and so since it's such a contrast to the damsel in distress, and it's putting forth this new woman in this new medium, as it were. Was there backlash, public backlash, industry backlash? Hey, the damsel's supposed to be tied to the railroad track. Why are they jumping all around and doing all this stuff?
I'm sure there might have been small organized protests at theaters, but I never came across any newspaper articles that covered anything like that.
It's always
long lines around the block. There were, for Patria, for example, that was actually censored by Woodrow Wilson, but that was a totally political thing. It had nothing to do with how Irene was being represented. It was the storyline, and that's a whole other story. But there was that kind of controversy with some of these films, and there was a little bit of controversy with some of the Mysteries of Myra and the sort of spiritualism and that kind of stuff, more sci-fi. But I haven't, and I would, if anyone has any primary sources they've come across that are of the time that are critical, I'd be interested to read. Yeah.
Well, 2 points on the damsel in distress. This is melodrama.
Yeah.
And the melodramas, the hero, whether it's a tragic or a classically comedic end, a happy ending, they must be the star and they must triumph.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, we've had the cowboy movies with Bill Hart and Tom Mix and so on. They were rescuing women and horses and children, but they were just almost props. They had barely even a co-star. So you simply cannot have a melodrama without
someone being saved.
Heroic figure. So I think that phrase, you just got to find out who said damsels in distress first, and whether they were talking about a meaningless, third line down credit, or did they mean a star? completely change of subject. I'm having a lot of fun thinking about my interest in the history of blue cinema, which of course, it all began at the same time. Burlesque and smokers and
Mhm.
all of it. And what's interesting is how the commercial, dirty movie business maintained so many of the vaudeville and silent movie
Yeah.
tropes that Hollywood, were like, oh, we don't do that anymore. For example, the alliteration,
Mhm.
Debbie Does Dallas.
Yes.
And of course, that a lot of it is silent. And it's one stunt after the next, often with very little aesthetic pulling it together. In other words,
Yeah.
there's a train. There's a train. And things keep, but you just keep one stunt after the next. So it's fun to think about how they began at the same time.
Yes.
But the bastardized, sort of the unseen, blue stepchildren of the movie business kept using silent movie
Yeah.
classic ways of working.
Yeah. It's really interesting. And I mean, I came across so many fascinating things when I was preparing for this talk. One of them was billed as a comedy, but involved representation of a trans woman from 1904 by the Lubin Film Corporation, which is out of Philadelphia, in North Philadelphia. They did a remake of a French film called The Personal, in which a guy writes a personal ad for a wife to come meet him when he's looking for a wife to come meet him on the steps of this tomb. But then in the remake of it, which happened in, I think, the same exact year, this American version of it is meet me at the fountain. And then all these women show up and basically become the chase scene, all these desperate women show up trying to get this husband. And then chase down this guy. And the very end of the American version is a kiss. Like there's this intense kiss between a trans woman and the man who wrote the personal advertisement. And it's like, kind of blows my mind. Yes, it was billed as a comedy, so there was that going on too, but to see that on screen, and the fact that in the remake of it that was done by the Lubin Film Corporation, that they made sure, because that wasn't in the French version, that was the ending moment in that one. So it's so much happening at this time, and I think so many things yet to discover, and it's just tragic that so many of these films are no longer with us. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Zoom folks.